Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to hit the like, share, and subscribe and the notification bell. Don't forget to subscribe at Locals for further updates and engagement with the channel. For those that already are subscribed to Locals, thank you for your support. Continued support keeps this content available. So, Logos, we're at our seventh episode on the Church Fathers, discussing the Martyrdom of Polycarp. So, the first thing is this is a letter written from the Church of Smyrna to the Church of Philomelium. Now, I know where Smyrna is. That's in western Turkey. I'm not sure where Philomelium is. It's probably somewhere in Turkey as well. And then broadly to all Christian churches. So, chapter 1, the martyrdom is useful for moral instruction, teaches how to love God and love our neighbor. So, this is setting the stage for this work as a kind of having a pedagogical function. Chapter 2, we need to, like Polycarp, focus on the eternal future and the hope of Christ to get us through. Something we'll see again later on in this account. Fear the fire that is never quenched, and not the fire that endures for about an hour, which we'll hear from the mouth of Polycarp a bit later. Polycarp is old. Chapter 3, the consul appeals to his old age in order to get him to burn the pinch of incense. The crowd arrayed itself against Polycarp and accused him of atheism. See, this is kind of weird, right? I don't know why. I don't know how the consul would appeal to his age, because if Polycarp's old and about to die, like, it doesn't really matter how he dies. Like, if Polycarp were 20, the consul could be like, "Oh, well, bro, like, you got another 40 years, 60 years to live. You don't want to cut your life short." That would make sense. Like, that makes sense. But if Polycarp, when we get to his age a little bit later, when he's as old as he is, this doesn't really seem to be a very effective inducement. What do you think?
Yeah, the only thing I could think of is if they're appealing to his frailty, right? You're so old man. There's no way you can take all of us, kind of thing. But other than that, I don't know.
Yeah, it didn't quite pan out. The other thing we see is that there's this attempt to be very. So, what I would say, having read this seems to be written in a style similar to the Book of Acts. So, the Book of Acts wants to give a lot of, within the narrative of the church of Peter and Paul and Pentecost and all that, they want to give specific information about what was going on in the world. Who's Caesar, who's the proconsul, who's the judge at this court hearing, because they want other people who read this to say, "Hey, this actually happened. These are like secular world events that are going on, and these are the people in charge," so that you know roughly the time frame this occurred in. And we see throughout this a similar style of writing in the Martyrdom of Polycarp, which is I think inspired, or at least analogically similar to the writing of Luke and Acts. So we see that basically one of the men that ended up betraying Polycarp is apparently a man named Quintus from Phrygia, who was frightened by wild beasts. Or sorry, no, he didn't betray Polycarp. He's a sort of counterpart to Polycarp. So this man was intimidated by wild beasts in the Colosseum, and out of cowardice, apostatized by burning a pinch of incense. So don't be like him. And he's that's why chapter 4 is there. Chapter 5 is Polycarp is said to have had a vision. He must burn with fire. And then, of course, through this vision, we're going to see a lens imposed on the broader narrative. The question is, well, is this a lens that the author is putting on the narrative, or is it something that we can take as veridical? I think that's where a lot of this discussion of the martyrdom of Polycarp is going to revolve around. How much of this is somewhat embellished versus veridical? This is also, I think, the earliest writing we have of what we might call, these sort of like eulogies to the saints, these sort of hagiographies. So this is technically the first hagiography where we're describing the death and martyrdom of a saint. Chapter 6, Polycarp is betrayed by servants into the hand of the ironarch Clearnomus. And then they pursue Polycarp. He fled to new lodgings, but he was captured. One of his servants was captured and tortured, who then betrayed Polycarp's location. There's a line saying, "Oh, this guy will eventually be punished like Judas." Chapter 7, the Romans aroused Polycarp with a troop of armed horsemen as if against the robber. That's from Jesus' arrest. "You come up against me as a man who's an armed robber." So there's a lot of these like scriptural overlays. Jesus says, "Don't fear the fire that burns for an hour, but the fire that burns forever. So there's this repetition of scriptural overlays on top of all this that is sort of contextualizing this narrative account here. And let's see, he chose not to escape but accept the will of God. I mean, yeah, we could also say he knew he was about to die anyhow, so might as well go out with a bang. In order to highlight his piety, the author says that he ate dinner and prayed for 2 hours, or that the men who arrested him were ashamed. I think you could say that's an oblique reference to the cross where the centurion says, surely this was the Son of God. So again, at this point, Polycarp is now in the hands of the Romans. Do you have anything you want to add to the first 7 chapters?
The only question I got is, what's the significance of this incense? Why are they trying to get him to do something with incense?
Well, it's essentially a religious ceremony where you worship the genius of Caesar. So the genius is sort of like a familiar spirit that gives inspiration and power to the Caesar. And of course, at this time as well, Caesar styled himself as a god. So you're basically worshiping Caesar and his genius as divine beings. And part of the ritual was to burn incense to them.
Gotcha. Okay. I reading this, I didn't know. I mean, I knew this was later Roman Empire, but I didn't know if they still had like a plurality of gods they worshipped, or if this was something else. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense that they're worshiping Caesar.
Right. Yeah. So let's see. So chapter 8, after Polycarp. Again, this is also trying to portray Polycarp as a Christ-like figure. He's placed on an ass. He's sent into the city during the Great Sabbath. That's sort of drawing inspiration from Palm Sunday. Now, again, we also see here attention to detail. Polycarp is met by the Ironarch Herod, his father Nicetes. Both are riding in a chariot. That's probably added because in order to demonstrate that I was there, or the people that I'm reporting who were there saw this, is because Herod and Nicetes went around in chariots a lot. So presumably by adding that, you're saying, well, look, that's more proof that I was there. They pleaded with him to offer incense, saying, is it really that much to ask? Polycarp said he wouldn't be dissuaded from his course of action. I think actually chapter 8, some of that might be worth reading, just to illustrate like where he's coming from. Polycarp was brought to the city. Now, as soon as he had ceased praying, having made mention of all that had at any time come in contact with him, both small and great, illustrious and obscure, as well as the whole Catholic Church throughout the world, the time of the departure having arrived, they set upon him an ass and conducted him into the city, the day being that of the Great Sabbath. And the Ironarch Herod, accompanied by his father Nicetes, both riding in a chariot, met him, and taking him up into the chariot, they seated themselves beside him and endeavored to persuade him, saying, what harm is there in saying Lord Caesar? So there you go, Lord Caesar, he's God. And in sacrificing with the other ceremonies observed on such occasions, and so much make sure of safety. But he at first gave them no answer, and when they continued to urge him, he said, I shall not do as you advise me. So they have no hope of persuading him, began to speak bitter words unto him, and cast him out with violence out of the chariot, insomuch that in getting down from the chariot, he dislocated his leg by the fall. But without being disturbed, as if suffering nothing, he went eagerly forward with all haste. It was conducted to the stadium, where the tumult was so great that there was no possibility of being heard. Also, again, Christ did not initially answer the accusations against him until the high priest abjured him by an oath. So that all of this chapter 8 is sort of trying to generate visions of Christ's trial by the Pharisees. Chapter 9, this is actually important. Chapter 9, he's in the stadium and he hears a voice from heaven, instilling in him courage. He's harangued by the crowd as an atheist. The Roman officials try to persuade him again to burn his pinch of incense. Polycarp refused, saying he would not betray Christ after 86 years of service. So let me read that little bit there where he talks about that. He says, let's see, where was I at? 9. That's right, 9. Polycarp declared, 86 years have I served him, and he never did me any injury. How then can I blaspheme my King and Savior? Okay, so this is kind of important for a broader Christian debate over baptism, and we covered that also in the Didache. So some people will say, well, clearly Polycarp is saying that, implicitly saying that he was baptized as an infant. Now, I think that's a problem with that because, one, we have other evidence elsewhere that that was not a common practice at this time. Second of all, how could we contextualize I've served Christ for 86 years? Well, A, he could be very old. He could be in his mid 90s. So let's say he's 95, 96. He's just not counting those 10 years he was a kid. Or, as you know, because he was raised in a Christian household, even that part of his life where he was a child and not fully cognizant of the faith, he was still serving Christ, though in that case without knowledge. But he was nonetheless still serving him. And later on, as he grew older, he served with knowledge. So Logos, how compelling do you find this as an argument for infant baptism?
I didn't even know it was an argument for infant baptism, but if it was one, I wouldn't think it's very forceful.
Right. Okay. Chapter 10, persuaded again to swear, Polycarp refused. So right now again, 3, right? Part of this, I think, is to be a counterpoise to Peter. So Peter denies Christ 3 times. Polycarp refuses to betray Christ 3 times. Because now they're going to kill him. The Roman officials wish to know. Now this is interesting. He asks, if the Roman officials wish to know the faith, and he says, "This is I think interesting." He says in chapter 10, and when the proconsul yet again pressed him and said, "Swear by the fortune of Caesar," he answered, "Since thou art vainly urgent that as thou sayest I should swear by the fortune of Caesar, and pretendest not to know who and what I am, hear me declare with boldness I am a Christian. And if you wish to learn what the doctrines of Christianity are, appoint me a day, and thou shalt hear them." The proconsul replied, "Persuade the people." But Polycarp said, "To thee I have thought it right to offer an account of my faith, for we are taught to give all due honor, which entails no injury upon ourselves, to the powers and authorities foreordained by God. But for these, I do not deem them worthy of receiving an account from me." So what's kind of interesting here is we see this, especially in the context like modern day Christianity, of evangelicalism of both left-wing and right-wing flavors, this more oppositional view to the civil authorities, which admittedly are still pretty tame right now. I mean, they're not rounding up Christians and killing them like we see here with Polycarp. And yet he's representing a more respectful attitude to them. And also, unlike modern day populism, where a lot of people will, pander to the crowd, Polycarp is like, yeah, these people are beasts. I'm not even going to talk to them. Do you have anything to say about that?
Not particularly, except Socrates tried to pander to the crowd once. It didn't work very well for Socrates, so it might just be a more broad joke rather than a narrow doctrinal thing, is how I'm reading it.
Well, that's actually a good point, especially since when we get to the end of this, we'll realize that the author of this is also named Socrates. So, chapter 11, Polycarp is threatened by wild beasts. He refuses a final appeal, and then he's burned. He makes it, and then this is where he specifically says, "Don't worry about the fire that burns for an hour, but for the fire that will never be put out." Let's see. Yeah, I want to read this too. But Polycarp said, "Thou threatenest me with the fire which burneth for an hour, and after a little while is extinguished. But art ignorant of the fire of the coming judgment and of eternal punishment reserved for the ungodly. But why tarriest thou? Bring forth what thou wilt." So again, we see this focus on the future hope that Christians have, which again in modern times is often overlooked in favor of this worldly benefits. Chapter 12, Polycarp holds fast to Christ. The Jews and the pagans rise up against him in the crowd. The crowd asks Philip the Asiarch to release a lion on Polycarp. He refuses, saying that the sporting events are over, which is then confirming Polycarp's original vision. Chapter 13, the crowd, assisted by the Jews, gather combustible material to immolate Polycarp. The Romans at first try to fix him with nails to, I guess, the stake, because they're going to burn him alive. And he prays to God for courage, faith, and endurance. Then instead of using nails, the Romans use bonds. So Christ, of course, is nailed to the cross. So I think the author of this is trying to say, well, Polycarp isn't quite good enough to die the way Christ did. He didn't get nailed. He describes Polycarp as a sacrificial ram. And he says that Polycarp offered a prayer to Christ, asking for strength and rejoicing and sharing in Christ's suffering. Chapter 15, when the prayer was over, he was lit on fire. The fire didn't consume him. Okay, that's the burning bush. That's the 3 children in the fiery furnace. And he glowed as gold and silver. Then Polycarp was pierced by a dagger, chapter 16. Blood came out. Okay, that's Christ on the cross, the spear of destiny. Extinguishes the fire. The dignity and grace with which Polycarp died inspired both Jews and pagans. How is it that he died so well and they don't die as well? So I think at this point we'll stop real quick and just comment that there's certainly a lot of typological references to biblical allusions, which again that's par for the course with hagiographies. And I think a lot of people will look at that and be like, are you just like forcing the narrative into this? Is that really how it happened? So there's that. We also see that there's a lot of reference to the Jews in the crowd. So this is sort of an extension. I think in part they're making references to Acts as well. Another Acts connection because Paul and Barnabas were chased around by the Jews from synagogue to synagogue. And then the fact that in this telling of the story, Polycarp dies with a grace and dignity that is better than that of the Gentiles and the Jews. Any thoughts on that?
No, I don't know enough about the biblical symbolism, so that's pretty interesting.
Okay, 17. The body of Polycarp was refused to the Christians on the account that Herod and his brother Alki suggested to Nicetes that if the Christians worship Christ after his death, they might do the same with Polycarp. Best not to give them the body. And then the Romans failed to appreciate that only Christ is to be worshipped by the Christians, not any of the saints. The martyrs and the saints are not worshipped, but loved as fellow companions and disciples in the common struggle. So this is also very important, and I feel like needs to be read in part. For this end, he suggested it to Nicetes, the father of Herod and brother of Alki, to go and entreat the governor not to give up his body to be buried, lest, said he, forsaking him that was crucified, they begin to worship this one. This, he said, had the suggestion and urgent persuasion of the Jews who also watched us as we sought to take him out of the fire, being ignorant of this, that it is neither possible for us to ever forsake Christ, who suffered for the salvation of such as shall be saved throughout the whole world, nor to worship any other. Okay, well, pretty clearly a narrative that does not agree with Catholic doctrine on the matter. So what I'm going to do here is in the screen sharing, we are going to add a new screen to share, first of all, the Catholic Encyclopedia. So before they say we don't worship anybody, Catholic Encyclopedia, veneration of the images. Moses says, thou shalt worship thy God, and him only thou shalt adore. Behold, before the word adore, he puts only, but not before the word worship, because it is lawful to worship creatures, since worshiping is only giving special honor. Okay, well, that's literally contradicted by the Martyrdom of Polycarp, which is also consistent with Revelation 22, verse 9. Then he said to me, see that you do not do that, for I am your fellow servant and of your brother the prophets, and of those who keep the word of this book, worship God. So any thoughts on that ruling?
I didn't know. We talked a little bit about this. I didn't know that the Catholics actually worshipped saints. I try to ask the Catholics about that, and what they usually tell me is something like, the saints are prayed to be intercessionary, I think is the word they use. The idea is the saints are closer to God than we are, because the saints are with God, awaiting the final judgment and so on. And so if you have a request, you pass it through the saints to give to God, basically. I don't know why you wouldn't just pray directly to God, as Jesus tells you to do in the New Testament. I don't know exactly what function the saints are supposed to serve there, but I mean, that seems innocent enough. But if that article is right, and they can go as far as worshiping the saints, I mean, given everything we've been reading up till now, that sounds like something you're not supposed to do. So,
well, I guess what I'll just say is this: like the Catholic Church, in a lot of ways, operates like a secret society. There's sort of like exoteric truths that converts are taught, that potential converts are taught. But if you like go into the deep lore of like the bowels of the Catholic theology and dogma, like the Catholic Encyclopedia, you'll see that, oh, No, they openly admit to worshiping these saints and saying that, this is completely acceptable. So, I mean, again, at a certain point, it does get murky and difficult. And, what are a lot of these people at the outer periphery deceived, or are they actively deceiving us? I mean, that's a bit hard to tell. I think the further up you go in the hierarchy, active deception becomes more likely. So, okay, we're wrapping this all up. Chapter 18, given to the Jews, brought up a great commotion about the body of Polycarp. The centurion burned his body and took the bones and deposited him in a resting place with honor. So we see here that while the mob, and specifically the Jews, are criticized, we see that the sort of respect for the civil magistrate, the implication here is that because Polycarp was respectful to the civil magistrate, that they were willing to give him a proper burial, in part. I think that's one inference you can get from this. And also you could say another layer is, well, if you honor Christ and keep his commandments, then, you get these positive outcomes. So that's another possibility. They say that Polycarp was in chapter 19, the 12th martyred in the Smyrna, Philadelphia region. The author says, we rejoice in the martyrdom since he endured to the end, won a crown of glory, sits with Christ in paradise, and is a model for us to follow. In chapter 20, so back to the beginning of this, it is from Smyrna to Philomelium. So this was sent by a man named Marcus, who's a brother in Christ. And he said, read the epistle when you arrive, glorify Christ. Averastus, the author of this epistle, salutes you. So now we go to the actual date of when Polycarp died. Died on the month of Zenithicus, 7 days before the Calids of May. So that's a pagan calendar. And then on the great Sabbath at the 8th hour. So that's like the Jewish calendar. So he's giving time for both pagans and Jews. And then he gives a list, again, in the same vein as Acts, in of Luke, of who's in charge. Herod was Irenaearch. Philip the Trallian was high priest. Stadius Quadratus was proconsul. And, of course, Christ is king. And then at the end, we read, well wishes for the brethren. Caius copied this from Irenaeus. Socrates, the author, transcribed this from Caius. And Poyanus wrote this from an older copy. Socrates claims that Polycarp inspired him to write this. Now, that seems kind of like we're moving into the territory of veneration of the saints, unless he means this in a more abstract sense, in the sense that he was inspired by the example of Polycarp to do this. But he says specifically, Polycarp having manifested them to me through a revelation. So, okay, there's a couple ways we could look at all this. One is this is interpolated to some degree. If that was the case, it's difficult to see why they wouldn't have tidied up chapter 17. so I don't know why that wouldn't have happened. Maybe they just weren't thorough enough, because that chapter 17 doesn't seem to quite match up with chapter 22. Also, there is this attempt to be very accurate to secular historical events, who's in charge, to sort of contextualize the story to make it sound plausible and realistic. So that's in its favor. But then there's also all of these biblical types that Polycarp is, the narrative is very structured, and that it's going through all of these. And the question is, well, did it really go through all these structure types? Was this just something that was added to make for a more holistic story? So I guess, Logos, as far as like, is this broadly veridical, given sort of what I've said, what would be your first blush response?
I mean, it seems to me that the base events might have happened, but I think that there was definitely a lot of symbolism infused into the story, probably for a morale boost. If you're in an early Christian church, you're seeing a bunch of people getting killed off all the time, especially a big name guy like, say, Polycarp. When you're reporting the news, you could just be like, "Yep, the Romans got another of us. GG, boys. Hope we don't die soon as well." Or you can kind of like insert a whole bunch of stuff into it to make the death sound epic, I guess, to make people not afraid and more committed, even as they lose more friends. And that seems to be kind of what they were doing.
Right. Yeah. And of course, I think in this particular instance, both, if we want to use the term the historical Polycarp, the historical Polycarp and the author of this particular edition, because as we know, this went through multiple editions. Both of them, I think, probably did want to go out with a bang. Polycarp's old; he's at least 86, possibly older. Um, there's this idea both in classical antiquity and in the Old Testament of having a noble death. So for the pagans, it would be dying in battle, and in the Bible, it'd be dying as a martyr for God or now Christ. So I think that's an easy sell. I think the idea that maybe the guy's taking a few too many liberties with Polycarp's desire to go out with a bang, but I think he's broadly correct in that assumption. What do you think?
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything you want to add before we wrap this up?
Yeah, there's one thing I wanted to point out. I think it was around chapter 7 or 8. Yeah, chapter 8.
Okay. Let's see, chapter 8. There's the whole chapter.
There it is. Illustrious and obscure, as well as the whole Catholic Church throughout the world. That struck me. Catholic Church. Had the Catholic Church actually been developed at that time? Did they call themselves the Catholic Church? I thought that didn't happen until later. What's up with that?
Right. Well, Catholic is a term that means universal, right? So, in one sense, whether you're Eastern Orthodox or Lutheran or Reformed, you would view yourself as a lower C Catholic church because we're the real Christians, not those Catholics over there, right? So in that sense, it just means universal. And in fact, everybody would call themselves Catholic, but it's almost like in this historical marketing game, the RCC sort of won that game.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't know Catholic meant universal. So I thought that this was like the Catholic Church kind of like putting their stamp on things retroactively.
That could be too, because that turn of phrase we haven't seen yet. But all I'm saying is it doesn't necessarily mean that. It could.
Right. Okay. Yeah, other than that, that's the only interesting thing I saw.
All right. Well, thank you, Logos. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.